Howl came out of the bathroom while Sophie was frying breakfast on Calcifer, and sat gracefully in his chair, groomed and glowing and smelling of honeysuckle. "Dear Sophie," he said, "when I happened to tear my eyes from a certain lovely face yesterday, I could have sworn I saw your long nose poking round the corner of the house." "Mrs. Fairfax is a family friend," said Sophie. "How was I to know you'd be there too?" "You have an instinct, Sophie, that's how. Nothing's safe from you. Well, you can jolly well help me out of my trouble with the king. That goes for you too, Michael. As I've told you, he's asked me to find his brother for him, with a strong hint that destroying the Witch of the Waste would come in handy too." It was clear that Howl was in a mood to produce green slime any second. "I'll make some hot buttered toast," said Sophie. "Is that all you could do in the face of tragedy?" asked Howl. "Make toast? No, you and Michael are going to the palace to blacken my name to the king." "Thank you very much," said Sophie, "and no, I won't." Howl spread out both arms. "Then let's have green slime again, after which I shall be forced to move the castle 1,000 miles away and never see my lovely Lettie again." Michael looked at Sophie imploringly. Sophie glowered. She saw well enough that the happiness of both her sisters depended on her agreeing to see the king. Howl smiled at her. "You are going to, aren't you?" "All right," said Sophie. "When do you want me to go?" "Tomorrow afternoon. Michael can go as your footman. The king will be expecting you." He began explaining very clearly and soberly just what Sophie was to say. By the time he'd finished, Sophie was wishing she'd never agreed. She was heartily relieved when Howl at last turned to Michael, who'd been waving the paper with the difficult spell on it. "Yes, Michael?" Michael explained in a rush how impossible the spell seemed to do, and how they'd tried to catch a shooting star. Howl took the paper and stared at it. One of his eyebrows shot up. "Sophie, dear." "What?" said Sophie. "Busy old fool," said Howl. "Am I right in thinking that you turned my doorknob black side down and stuck your long nose out?" "Just my finger," said Sophie. "But you opened the door," said Howl, "and this thing that Michael thinks is a spell must have got through. Didn't it occur to either of you that this doesn't look like spells usually do?" "Spells often look peculiar," said Michael. "And did I hear you say you went out and tried to catch a shooting star?" "Yes, but it was scared stiff and fell in a pool and drowned." "Thank goodness for that," said Howl. "Now promise me you'll never try to catch a shooting star again." "I promise," said Michael. "But what is that writing, if it's not a spell?" "It's called Song, but it's not all here, and I can't remember the rest of it. I think the next verse was important. I'd better take it back and see." He went to the door and turned the knob black down. Then he looked round. "All right. I know Sophie will squirm through somehow if I leave her behind, and that's not fair to Michael. Come along, both of you." He opened the door on the nothingness and walked into it. Michael and Sophie rushed after him. The nothingness was only inch thick after all. Beyond it, in a grey, drizzling evening, was a cement path down to a garden gate. Walking along it, Sophie looked back and found the castle had become a yellow brick house with large windows. "We need to be dressed in keeping with this place," said Howl. Suddenly, their clothes changed. To Sophie's surprise, Howl led the way back up the garden path towards the yellow house. The back of his baggy jacket had mysterious words on it. "Welsh Rugby." Howl unlocked a wavy glass door with one of his keys and pushed Sophie into a neat, shiny hall space. Loud voices were coming from behind the nearest door. When Howl opened it, Sophie realised that the voices were coming from magic-coloured pictures moving on the front of a big square box. "How well!" exclaimed a woman who was sitting there knitting. She put down her knitting, but before she could get up, a small girl leapt up. "Uncle Howell!" she screamed, and jumped halfway up Howl with her legs wrapped round him. "Mary!" bawled Howl. "How are you, Cariad? Been a good girl, then?" He and the little girl broke into a foreign language then, fast and loud. In between bursts of chatter, Howl managed to say, "This is my niece Mary, and my sister Megan Parry. Megan, this is Michael Fisher, and Sophie, Hatter," said Sophie. Megan shook hands. "How well," she said. "Are you staying long?" "Just dropped in for a moment," said Howl, lowering Mary to the floor. "Thought I'd introduce you to my friends here, and I want to ask you something that may sound silly. Has Neil, by any chance, lost a piece of English homework lately?" "Funny you should say that," said Megan. "Looking everywhere for it he was last Thursday. Ask him, he's up in the front bedroom with that machine of his." Howl took Mary's hand and led them all up the stairs to a room where two boys were crouched over various magic boxes. Howl walked straight over and pulled the boxes out of the wall by their roots. "Neil," he said. "How do?" "Who is he?" asked the other boy. "My no-good uncle," said Neil. "What do you want? Put that plug back in." "I'll put it back when I've asked you something and you've answered." He held the shiny grey paper out in front of Neil. "Do you know what this is?" "It's my long-lost homework. Where did you find it? Was that funny writing that turned up yours? Miss Angorian said it was interesting and took it home with her." "Oh, thank you," said Howl. "Where does she live?" "That flat over Mrs. Phillips' tea shop, Cardiff Road." Sophie wished to forget the next bit. They rode in a carriage without horses that went at a terrifying speed, smelling and growling and shaking as it tore down some of the steepest roads Sophie had ever seen. She shut her eyes and clung to some of the pieces that had torn off the seats and simply hoped it would be over soon. Luckily it was. They arrived in a flatter road with houses crammed in on both sides. Beside a large window filled with a white curtain, a notice said, "Teas. Closed." Despite this forbidding notice, when Howl pressed a button at a small door beside the window, Miss Angorian opened the door. For a schoolteacher, Miss Angorian was astonishingly young and slender and good-looking. She had sheets of blue-black hair hanging round her olive-brown, heart-shaped face and enormous dark eyes. She looked at Howl. "I take a small guess that you are Howl Jenkins." For an instant, Howl was taken aback. Then his smile snapped on. Goodbye, thought Sophie, to the pleasant dreams of Lettie and Mrs. Fairfax. For Miss Angorian was exactly the kind of lady someone like Howl could be trusted to fall in love with on the spot. And not only Howl. Michael was staring admiringly too. And though all the houses around were apparently deserted, Sophie had no doubt they were full of people who knew both Howl and Miss Angorian and were watching with interest to see what would happen.